Thank you so much, Omar, for joining us. And we're very happy that Professor Jennifer Hochschild is going to introduce you. She's Professor of Government and of African and African American Studies here at Harvard. Please begin, Jennifer.
I'm happy to do so. I'm delighted to see Omar. He and I have gone back a long way, and we have lots and lots of email exchange, but I haven't actually seen your face in a long time, so that's terrific. I will give a brief introduction because nobody's here to hear me. Omar got his BA at Stanford University, got his PhD in African American Studies and an MA in Statistics, both at Harvard, with predominant focus in the government department, which is how he and I got to know each other very well. He's been teaching at Princeton for some years, and he's now moving to Pomona as of next year. So I guess you're living in Los Angeles at this point and physically in California, if it doesn't fall into the ocean. But in any case, he'll be at Pomona next year. Omar has, as many of you probably know, a very exotic background. I will not go through all the details of it, but I can't resist a couple points. I remember going to conferences when Omar was first a graduate student, and my colleagues, faculty at other universities would say, "Do you know Omar Wasow? Is he really your student?" So I gained credibility in the real world as a consequence of being his professor. He created Black Planet, which is one of the first major networking sites. It had up to 3 million African-American participants. He started a charter school in Brooklyn. He taught Oprah Winfrey how to surf the web. He is described in an article, and I spare you the details, as, quote, Silicon Valley philosopher prince. So there we have him. He now, of course, teaches at Princeton and is a full-fledged regular academic, which is why he's here for our purposes. He's won teaching awards. He's got this fabulous new article, which is what he's going to talk about today, called Agenda Seeding. It's the lead article in the American Political Science Review, which is by far the leading journal in political science. So this is a very big deal. I will make one very brief final comment about the contemporary philosopher prince, not the old philosopher, former philosopher prince. I just read recently, quote, JP Morgan's investment bank is making news by telling investors to position for a Trump re-election due to perceptions of violent demonstrations. And they have a long explanation of why they're telling their investors to do that. The bottom line is, quote, we based our quantitative analysis on the academic work of Omar Wasow, see here, and applied his work to the current situation. Omar and I have been going back and forth a little bit on whether this is actually an appropriate application, and he may or may not want to say more about that. If he doesn't, I'll ask him later. But the final thing I would say is just one of the phrases I use in my letters of recommendation for Omar over many, many years is he has, quote, more ideas per minute than anybody I know. And that's my best description of him. He's just a fabulous scholar. He's a fabulous person. I'm thrilled to see you, and we're really excited to hear this talk. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I would not have, this work would not exist but for your support, and the championship of you and Professor Gates really is, the foundation on which this is built. So I'm incredibly grateful for those kind words, and also, the first person thanked in the paper is Jennifer Hochschild, and there's a reason for that. So I want to thank you for all your support over many years. And in particular, and let me jump into now slides. I think part of why this work was this is something I've been working on for about 15 years, and going back to when I first arrived in the African American Studies department. And so it's a particular honor to be able to present this now to the department and to the colloquium, the fellowship, in part also as a Du Bois fellow. And part of why this work, I think, took so long to kind of come to the forefront is that it was wrestling with some difficult ideas that also sat at the margins of political science. And so I'm incredibly grateful to Jennifer for seeing the value in this work when it was not always seen as mainstream work. So just to begin, I'm going to not go through everything in these slides, but this is kind of the overview. I want to set up kind of an initial puzzle. And in particular, there's a debate that was happening in the 1960s in the Black community about what the best ways African Americans could use to advance the the Black freedom struggle, right? And so here we've got Bayard Rustin, who was a key advisor and a major influence on King. And Rustin was a very pragmatic activist. So in his model, which I in the paper call a median white voter theorem, he says, basically African Americans are a statistical minority. So neither the civil rights movement nor the country's 20 million Black people can win political power alone. We need allies. The future of the Negro struggle depends on whether the contradictions of this society can be resolved by a coalition of progressive forces, right? So if you are 10% of the population, as African Americans were in the 1960s, like in a majoritarian system, how do you gain power? You gain it in coalition. We can also look at folks like Ella Baker, who had a very sort of grassroots model of activism and said, we need to have this we don't need a strong leader, we need strong people. We need a society, or rather a movement that's focused on building capacity at the grassroots. On the other side of this debate were folks like Stokely Carmichael, here pictured again next to King. And Carmichael is like a remarkably interesting character in that he begins as actually a protege of Bayard Rustin's, and then becomes a protege of King, and then goes on to really become a champion of Black power. In one of his famous speeches at Berkeley, he says, the only time I hear people talk about nonviolence is when Black people move to defend themselves against white people. Black people have already been nonviolent too many years. And he, like others, Robert Williams, Malcolm X, takes a kind of conditional endorsement of violence, right? That there's a kind of an eye for an eye logic for how African Americans should fight and resist white supremacy. Angela Davis also famously was both a professor at UCLA, but someone who argued for a kind of conditional use of violence in response to the kind of white supremacist terror she experienced as a child in Birmingham. She says, in response to a question, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions as things like violent protests, right? So there's this debate about tactics, and just more generally, I should say, this is a debate that's not exclusive to the Black community. This is something that groups around the world wrestle with and then trying to advance their interests. So the 1960s in the United States are a useful way to test these kind of competing theories of how a social movement can be effective. And in particular, there's data on a set of nonviolent Black-led protests, about almost 3,000 in a data set called the Dynamics of Collective Action. And then there's data both in Dynamics of Collective Action and in another data set called the Carter data set of about between 700 and 800 protests which include protester-initiated violence. And I'm going to go into that more, but just to get a sense of the kind of, sort of the timing of these events, if we look at this upper row here, these are events that are nonviolent. That is to say, the protesters are nonviolent. The state may engage in violent repression, and this is the estimated number of protesters per month. And what we can see is that in this period around 1963-64, it really spikes significantly, right? And then if we look in this section where we have violent protests, and I should clarify, these are often called urban riots, because I'm comparing protests where protesters are primarily nonviolent to events where protesters may include violent tactics. Those are the two categories I have, violent and nonviolent protests. And here we can see it's much more kind of episodic, going up and down over the building up until 68. I'll go into that more. And one other thing I should note, just in terms of comparing these two, here we're talking about up to about 20,000 people, and in the nonviolent case, we're talking up to 200,000, right? This is like the March on Washington here, 250,000 people. So this is mainly just to get a sense of timing. The point is, in the 1960s, there's a lot of protest activity. There's a lot of variation in tactics. We can use that to try and test, is there, what kinds of results happen in these two different waves of activity. So let me quickly go through some theory. I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but I think it's important to set up. In political science, there's a debate about whether elites dominate political communication. And here, Marty Gillens has a co-authored piece that is helpful, right? So they look at a bunch of different issues, and they find mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence, right? So that's an elites dominate story. And also in political science is more of a pluralistic model. We see for example, from Tae-Koo Lee, evidence looking also at the 1960s nonviolent protests that oppositional counterpublics are critical sites for the emergence of non-elite influence on mass opinion. So building on Lee and Michael Dawson, that's the tradition that this work is kind of coming from, but we have a debate about, do we have evidence of a kind of pluralistic, a bottom-up, a more marginal voices being heard in democracy approach? And that's a debate within political science. And part of what's useful about looking at the 1960s is not only do we have that variation in tactics, but we also have variation in what people think the most important problem is in the country. And I should clarify, at this time, the United States is 90% white. So when if you get a result like we do in this period right here around 1963-64, where civil rights emerges as the most important problem in America, that's telling us that white Americans are answering this question. Most important problem is civil rights. Also importantly, though, in a later part of the 1960s, we get this sort of bluish line. These are kind of smooth trend lines. And there's this measure for social control, where social control is people answering things like crime or riots. And we see that there's this spike around concern about things like crime and riots in the late 60s and early 70s. And it's too hard to see in this scale, but that emerges as the most important problem in specific periods in the late 60s as well. So one other puzzle is, how do we explain this variation in public opinion around race-related topics? And the pluralistic model can't really explain this, because what a lot of people have said is, well, it's like things like elections are driving concern about civil rights. This dotted line here is an election, this dotted line here is an election, this dotted line here is an election. And what you can see is that civil rights is going down as we go into the election. So it's not clearly being driven by a presidential campaign. Here it's relatively flat. So it's not obviously candidates who are driving this, campaigns are driving this. Similarly, if we look at the social control measure, the smooth measure of social control, it's not changing as we go into the 68 presidential election. So it's not obvious that elites are driving this public opinion. So what else could it be? Well, obviously, I'm going to make a case that protests are driving it, but the pluralistic model also isn't quite enough, because it doesn't explain the difference between this period and this period. If we just say, well, protests, then that you need some additional detail to explain why civil rights in one moment and why crime and riots in another. So I'm proposing a model in which the media play a really important role. And while the media favor elite narratives, there is this elite dominance, they also have concerns about profits and drama. And sometimes those will work against elites, right? So you can think of something like a scandal involving a politician that may help sell newspapers, but it's not good for elites, right? And similarly, protests can be very powerful in this way. And so what I'm drawing on literally the theory, the language of activists in the 60s, and people talked about staging protests. Both King and John Lewis talk about dramatizing injustice. So I think of this really quite literally as a kind of theater, where the idea is to stage an event in which the media are drawn in, and that helps to amplify these marginal voices to a national and often international audience. And that nonviolent and violent disruption are creating a kind of morality play that, in a single image, in a video clip, helps to frame the larger narrative of what's going on here. In particular, the profound injustice, the brutality of Jim Crow is being revealed in these morality plays, and segregation more generally. But nonviolent and violent tactics don't always produce the same effects. Violence is very powerful for drawing in the media, but when protesters are the object of violence, you get more sympathetic coverage. When protesters are perceived to be the initiators of violence, you get more coverage that focuses on things, again, like crime and riots. And so agenda seeding is what in kind of political science, there's a literature around agenda setting. The media and elites can, what they talk about becomes part of what the general public is concerned about. And here I'm trying to say there's a step before agenda setting, before the media tells people what to think about, that's agenda seeding, and that activists can kind of push their issues, their concerns onto the national stage through things like protests. So just very quickly, you can understand that elites can influence the media, and the elites can speak, maybe in the current era through Twitter to the mass public. But here we've got mass-based groups that are able to talk to media, to influence media through things like protests, right? And one key idea is that almost nobody observes a protest. So how can a protest be influential on something like public opinion? Through the media. So I'm going to try and show that. And then just finally, some assumptions, right? We're talking about the theory here I want to generalize beyond the case of African Americans in the 1960s fighting for freedom. But I want to think about, so what are the general principles? It's got to be a place where there's an active media. So it's got to be a semi-democratic society at a minimum. And I'm imagining sort of two coalitions, one that's more status quo, maintaining the hierarchy, and another that's more egalitarian. And that there are all sorts of inequalities that favor the dominant aligned coalition. So that might be bias in the media, it might be all kinds of state repression, things like COINTELPRO. And so in the face of that inequality, how can essentially David beat Goliath? And one other assumption is that even though there's this inequality, there's some persuadable members of the dominant group. So this is the core of the theory that activists, organizers, protesters have some agency, they have some ability to pick tactics in a given moment, and that they can opt to use more nonviolent tactics or more aggressive resistance to white supremacy. And that the state can then respond, but protesters don't organize, don't have any control over that. If the state is relatively peaceful in something like the March on Washington, you end up with a case where the media tends to focus on issues of rights, and that tends to grow the coalition grow the egalitarian coalition. In the other case, we might have more protester-initiated violence. That can lead to an event like Watts. Media tends to focus on, again, riots, disorder, and that grows the kind of order maintenance status quo coalition. And importantly, I should clarify one other case, which is the state engages in brutal repression, something like Bloody Sunday in Selma, and that is, in a kind of bitter irony, the best case for the movement. That generates a lot of coverage because there's violence. The media, when it bleeds, is a cliche in local media. That gives you more rights-focused coverage, and again, it grows the egalitarian coalition. So those are the main cases. I'm gonna just show a few slides of those cases, but I think these are ones that are sort of paradigmatic, so people know them. But so in that first case, the March on Washington, here's Rustin, the kind of master organizer of that event, an enormous success, again, 250,000 people converging in DC, a non-trivial logistical matter, celebrities, here's Baldwin, and I'm blanking on who he's with there, forgive me. And within a year, we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? So and the spike in movement activity is, this captures both national and international media. We also can look at something like the case of Watts, and that's this lower case here. And just to give a little bit of context, right? Barry Goldwater is running in 1964 for president. He runs on Law and Order. He loses massively. At the same time, a couple years later in '66, Ronald Reagan runs for governor of California, also on Law and Order. He wins. He beats Pat Brown, the incumbent, a Democrat, and a relatively popular Democrat. And one of the explanations is that what happens in Watts is driving a non-trivial number of Democrats to defect from the Democratic coalition to the Republican coalition. In fact, and so there are an estimated 3,000 incidents of arson in Watts. There are, there's this kind of massive military National Guard presence that comes in. There are dozens of people shot by police and National Guard. So it's a major act of resistance to the kind of state violence, but also one in which there's a lot of protester-initiated violence. And in the write-ups of that, notably, you see here, computer analysts reported that the white backlash voters, those motivated by Negro demonstrations and demands, played an important part in the Brown defeat, right? So that's the LA Times in 1965. And that's, question is, does that hold when we run statistical analyses using, kind of more data and other evidence? And what I find is that protests do move voters. And so in the paper, I'm asking now a question, do protests influence voting? And I'm looking with what's called a panel design, taking 3 different elections, 64, 68, 72, and seeing when you compare a county to itself and expose it, where exposure is if there's a nonviolent or a violent protest within 100 miles of that county, does it shift from its historical voting pattern? And what we see is, and I control for a bunch of things, I'm not going to go too much into that, but there's a basic way of sort of, I define some counties as, quote, treated by a protest. Are there at least 10 people in a protest within 100 miles within 2 years of an election, or at least 10 people arrested within 100 miles within 2 years of an election? And what I find is, on a variety of specifications, that nonviolent protests, when we compare all counties, some exposed, some not, contribute to a positive shift in the Democratic vote share. So this is the change in Democratic county vote share. And what we see is that the main takeaway here is that there's an increase of about 1 to 2 percentage points in the counties exposed to nonviolent protest activity. And again, what the story is that there's some protests, there's media coverage, that sort of helps grow a coalition. The county moves a little bit on average. What we see conversely, using 2 different data sets, this dynamics of collective action data, or a data set collected by a sociologist, Greg Carter, who importantly shared with me this data in my first year of grad school at Harvard, is that, again, across a wide variety of specifications, where we are looking maybe just the white counties or comparing counties that look very similar to each other in a pre-treatment period, that there's a negative effect. The counties proximate to violent protests vote more conservatively. This is using the number of participants. This is using the number of arrests. So a shift of about 2 to 6 percentage points away from the Democratic coalition in counties proximate to protests that escalate, that include protester-initiated violence. So that's correlations that, using this method of comparing a county to itself, control for a lot of things. But in social science now, there's a heavy emphasis on trying to sort of really get at causality. And so here I do an additional set of analyses where I'm asking, does a county, can we say that protests that escalate to violence are truly causing this shift? Maybe there's some other factor. People are resisting white supremacy more in the South, and the South is shifting more conservatively, and so I'm actually, it's confounded in some way. So I do another analysis, which is called an instrumental variable analysis. This is the IV here, looking at protests on voting. And the basic idea is that when Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, in this sort of terrible act of, again, white supremacist violence, we get 137 protests that escalate to violence immediately following King's assassination. And that set of protests in April of 1968 are potentially influenced by rainfall. And there are 2 economists, Margot and Collins, who have used rainfall in April of 1968 to show long-run effects of what they call urban riots and what I'm calling violent protests. So I take rainfall in April of 1968, and the basic idea is, if it rains, there's less likely to be a gathering. If it doesn't rain, there's more likely to be a gathering. And of course, that's probabilistic, but it's been shown across a wide variety of events, from July 4th gatherings to Tea Party protests. And I even find in my archival work evidence. Here's heavy downpour dampens protest. Charles Evers, this is the brother of Medgar Evers, disappointed but not dismayed because the crowd did not reach his anticipated 2,000 figure. This is not a post-King protest, but this is just an example of, it's sort of intuitive, right? People don't want to walk in the rain. People don't want to go outside in the rain. So what I find is, so we can think of rainfall as acting as a kind of random assignment mechanism. Some counties get rainfall, some counties don't. Counties that are exposed to rainfall are less likely to have the protests that escalate to violence. And then we can say, well, does rainfall in April influence voting in November? And if it does, the only one very reasonable way to think about that is it's moving through the channel of protests. And so just to start, if we look at the 95% of those 137 protests that occur in the week following King's assassination, April 4th to 10th, excuse me, I find there is a significant negative effect, call it about 8 percentage point shift away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. But importantly, someone could say, well, maybe you're picking up, maybe it rains more in the South and there's more of a shift away from the Democratic Party in the South. Well, if we look at 2 other periods in April 1st to 3rd, where there's no protests, so we should expect that rainfall before King's assassination should not have much predictive power because it's not influencing any protests because no protests have occurred. And in fact, it does not, rainfall in that first period is indistinct, the predictive power, the range of possible values includes 0, so we can't reject the possibility that there's no effect, right? So that's what these are telling us. And if we look in April 11th to 30th, when 5% of protests occur, again, these are not statistically distinguishable from no effect. So it's not just rainfall anytime in April, it's really only in this one period of April 4th to 10th. And so that says pretty, unless somebody has an alternate story about why rainfall in April, in 1 week in April only, is influencing voting in November, it suggests that that's moving through the channel of violent protests and that violent protests are causing a shift away from the Democratic Party. Does that matter? You can lose a county but still win a state. So I do another analysis where now I'm sort of saying, do protests influence the 1968 election? I do a simulation, sort of like what you might see if you looked at 538 or The Economist, or now the New York Times does this too. And what I find is if I simulate 10,000 elections where you imagine about a 2 percentage point shift, imagine King isn't assassinated, imagine there isn't a violent protest in some county, and that conservatively we say, well, there's about a 2 percentage point shift that, the Republicans gain 2 percentage points. If there was this violent protest, now that goes back to Humphrey. If Humphrey gains 2 percentage points, then some states are slightly more Democratic, and some states then might shift from going to Nixon to Humphrey. Importantly, it's a very close election. Think of it like 2016, a small number of votes shifting can tip the election. And what I find simulating 10,000 counterfactual elections where there's about this 2 percentage point shift, importantly, only in the counties proximate to a violent protest, that basically a majority, the modal event is that Humphrey wins. And he gains enough votes to get 275,000 electoral votes. And also, I think noteworthy, we often focus on Nixon winning with a Southern strategy. But what we see is that the states that are tipping are not the South, right? George Wallace takes the Deep South, and the states that are tipping, and I'm just going to go back here, right? The states that are tipping are, the states that are tipping are Delaware, Illinois, Missouri, New Jersey, Ohio. These are the places that are both close enough that a few percentage points can matter, and there's a significant amount of violent protest activity following King's assassination. And so in some ways, we can think about this as the Southern strategy is in some ways misnamed because George Wallace takes the Deep South. Places like Texas are Democratic. And so it's the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic that are tipping. And that, again, is remarkably similar to what we saw in 2016. It's states that, the tipping point states, the states that are pivotal are not the Deep South, which importantly is not going to go from it's not going to go from George Wallace to Humphrey, right? Wallace is a segregationist. Humphrey was the lead author of the Civil Rights Act. So now, just to begin to think about mechanism, right? I said before that the media was really driving this, and I'm going to try and do some tests to see, can we show media as a key intermediary? Here, this is data we've seen before, but now plotted slightly differently. So number of protesters per month is one axis, percent saying civil rights is the most important problem in America is this other axis. The green line is public opinion. And what you can see is that as the March on Washington is happening, right? Here's the March on Washington. We get that 250,000 folks in DC. There's this big spike in concern about civil rights. We also see it when the 1964 Civil Rights Act is happening. So there is an elite effect when Congress is debating the Civil Rights Act and protest activity is decreasing. We still see another spike in civil rights concerns. So the point is not that elites have no influence on public opinion. Clearly they do dominate, but not exclusively. Selma here is, I think, one of the most dramatic examples, right? Bloody Sunday happens, and there's this incredible spike in concern about civil rights. Importantly, there's a remarkable bit of history in a book called The Race Beat. ABC is broadcasting a documentary about the Nuremberg trials. It interrupts this documentary about war crimes to show footage of segregationists in the South, beating people like John Lewis, breaking his skull. And so suddenly Americans around the country are confronted by this contrast between German war crimes and the Jim Crow South. And that moves public opinion, and it turns out thousands of people around the country to want to ally with that march. Again, one more spike with the Voting Rights Act. Again, Congress does, what Congress is talking about does influence media and public opinion, but not exclusively. If we look at public opinion on when, so now I'm looking at violent protest arrests, and I take the log just because some events are so much larger, I want to kind of compress those, so it just kind of it makes the scale more even. And the red line here is percent saying social control is the most important problem. And again, as we've discussed, there's this kind of episodic quality where as the number of people arrested in these events is happening, there's a spike in public opinion, initially quite small, but then by 1967, we see these, when Newark and Detroit have these major events, again, many buildings set on fire, many people killed by the National Guard. I think the National Guard in Newark, or maybe it's Detroit actually, shoots something like 14,000 rounds of ammunition. But importantly, it goes down in the summer. It's down in the winter, and then up in the summer, and then down in the winter, and then up in the summer. And when I was first looking at these data, I just thought, oh, public opinion data is noisy. It bounces around. When I overlaid them, suddenly it was like, oh no, there's a structure here, right? If this was just, racism, we'd have to explain, well, why is racism seasonal? I'm not saying racism isn't an important factor, but there's something else combined with white antipathy that's helping to drive this concern about crime and riots. One other event that I think is worth noting here, this is the Attica prison uprising. And this is one of the few spikes in public concern about social control that's not happening in the summer. This is in October, Attica is in September, right? So again, just an N of one, but suggestive that what's happening on the ground is really driving a public narrative. So can we do this in another kind of more statistically rigorous way? Well, I collected 275,000 front page headlines between 1960 and 1972 and looked for words like civil rights and voting rights or riots in Attica, and sort of said, did a protest today influence headlines tomorrow? And what I find, if you just plot them, is that in fact, yes, that as we see, so the three lines here, there's a lot to follow now. Public opinion about civil rights, this is the most important problem we've seen. Headlines with civil rights and nonviolent protest participants. And the basic idea is it's participation driving headlines, driving public opinion. And what we can see is that when there is this spike in, again, the dashed purple line is protest activity. When protest activity goes up, headlines go up and public opinion goes up. When protest activity goes down, headlines go down, public opinion goes down. In this period here, this is when the legislation is being considered. Protest activity is co-varying with headlines and public opinion, but really this is probably a legislation bump. Then we have Selma again, and another spike in public opinion, spike in headlines, and then it starts to taper off. But importantly, we see this covariance. And when I test that statistically, and I'm not going to show that, a headline today about, a protest which is primarily nonviolent today predicts a headline tomorrow that focuses on civil rights. Conversely, when there are protests, there's a significant protester-initiated violence, it predicts a headline tomorrow about riots. And so, again, the main thing we're looking here is, do these things seem to move together? When there's violent protest arrests, we see headlines that mention crime or mention riots or Attica, goes up and down again in 67. 68 is a little harder to make sense of. I don't have public opinion data for a very long stretch of time. King is assassinated in here. And so it may be that there's sympathy for King. It may be that public opinion is moving, but we just don't measure it. But importantly, violent protest activity goes up and headlines go up. In this, and again, we see a similar pattern of now 69, violent protest activity and public opinion, not as obvious in the headlines, and things start to shift as we go out. Public opinion continues to bounce, violent protest activity going down. Here, I suspect what's going on is that you've got much of the concern about riots is anti-war protests, and that's not being picked up in my data because I'm focused on civil rights activity. So, so it's not, it doesn't hold for the entire period, but when we test this statistically, it does. That a protest that includes violent tactics does predict a headline tomorrow that has the word riot in it. So what's happening on the ground is influencing coverage and is influencing public opinion. So nonviolent protests increase coverage of civil rights, violent protest events increase coverage of riots. Again, I do a bunch of statistical tests, and importantly, a nonviolent protest does not predict a headline about riots. A violent protest does not predict a headline about civil rights. So it's not just that events on the ground are generating any old coverage. There's a very specific relationship between the tactics and the type of coverage. And that framing, I argue, in a book project now, is really, we can think about kind of two sorts of stories. There's a kind of mythology of a legitimate claim, a redress of grievances is one American mythology, and another is hundreds of years of sort of pathologizing Black people, treating Black life as inherently lawless, and that racist mythology is part of what's being drawn upon in the, these aren't protests, these are riots. So just to kind of touch on that a little bit more, right, do we see the tactics influencing the kind of framing that individual articles have? This is now doing more of a content analysis of articles, not just headlines. So I took 500 events and collected about 4,000 articles that reference those events. And what we see is that when events are coded as nonviolent by in these data sets, the kind of language that's used, the scale here is a ratio of terms used primarily in articles where protesters are considered nonviolent, where protesters include violent tactics. And so it's a ratio comparing news articles about one kind of event to news articles about another kind of event. And when protesters are nonviolent, we see a disproportionate use of words like church, king, march, demonstration, civil rights, right? These are kind of in that legitimate claim for grievances frame. When protesters are coded as violent, we get words like shot, fire, riot, store, night, right? And those are disproportionately used. And the and importantly, if we look even at specific words, I know I said importantly probably 15 times now, forgive me. A word like store in the nonviolent events, about half the time is when the store is an object of a boycott, a sit-in, or a lunch counter protest. For events that are coded as violent, stores occurring about 3/4 of the time in articles where there's the word riot, or half of the time with the word loot, right? So even a relatively neutral term is being used really differently across these two kinds of articles. So plausibly, the kinds of images that are being constructed in the larger public's mind are varying, not just as a function of headlines, but as a function of the content. Again, a word like nation is showing up about 1/4 of the time as part of National Guard in nonviolent events, but half of the time in events that are coded as having protester violence. So now, just to kind of get to the very last bit, all the stuff I've shown you has been sort of more aggregate, like county level effects. This is some work that's not in the paper, and it's, again, sort of part of this larger book project, looking at public opinion data in the 1960s. And there were polls that were done in like October 65, 1,200 Californians are surveyed. And what I want to get at is, can we get individual level influences of responses to protest activity? And here, this particular question asked so Watts uprising is August 65, so October 65 is really close to that. We have questions about the LA riots, things like, one thing the riots did was to bring attention to the bad conditions that exist in the Negro slums. So more sympathetic reading of these events. You also have questions like, the riots prove that Negroes are not yet ready to be accepted in respectable law-abiding society, or the police should crack down harder and faster when Negroes get out of line, right? So more punitive reading of how these events and more negative. And so I take all of these questions, add them up, and we get a scale. And what we see is that when asked about your probability of voting for Pat Brown, governor of California, competing against Reagan, that if you had a more negative reaction to these, what again the survey called LA riots and racial disturbances, there's about call it 15% chance you're going to vote for Brown. As your attitudes about the events gets more positive, it goes up to about a 75% chance you're going to vote for Brown. So, this is a more than 50 percentage point shift in support for the Democratic candidate as a function of your attitudes about these, LA riot and racial disturbances. So that's a huge difference, and plausibly consistent with the story we saw that says there's some defection from the Democrats to the Republican candidate. I'm going to look at a different question. This is a much simpler question, a different survey. This was done from a survey group, Lewis Harris and Associates, and they said Brown was lax in the way he handled the Watts riot. Again, probability of voting for Brown. And interestingly, it's not anybody who shifts, right? Republicans don't move whether you disagree that Brown was lax or you agree. And the way to make sense of that is if you're a Republican, you weren't very likely to vote for the Democratic candidate anyway. You were probably going to vote for the Republican. So your attitudes about Watts don't seem to have much influence on your support for Brown. But for Democrats, there's again, from a 75% chance likelihood of voting for Brown if you disagree he was lax, to if you thought he was lax, about a 25% chance, right? So about a 50 percentage point drop in support as a response to that question. Importantly, again, if we disaggregate by race, it's not African Americans who are leaving the Democratic Party in large numbers. It's really whites who are moving to the Republican, and so we can think of this movement as being very much a function of, it's white Democrats who are these voters who are not necessarily opposed to civil rights. They might stay in the Democratic coalition, but it's not enough of a priority for them that when they become concerned about things like order, they don't defect to the Republican Party. And so that's really the that gets us a little bit more at what individual attitudes are what's driving this. And just in case anybody cares, I'm controlling for a bunch of things here like age and income and religion. So this is really trying to get at just the effect of this question and things like race or party. So just to wrap, couple of core implications and contributions, right? So not in political science, yes, elites do dominate, but I argue that there's a kind of punctuated pluralism. Mass movements can exert influence over public opinion. Tactics matter, that what happens on the ground is influencing media coverage, and media coverage is influencing public opinion, attitudes, and voting. So in electoral politics, that really matters, because if you're the statistical minority, it's really important to try and hold together a governing coalition. The methodological stuff is not so important, but some of what I'm adding here is that other studies often looked at like protest activity by the year, and that misses all of this like within year variation, or they might look at within the state, that misses important within state kind of county level variation. And then just two more kind of final points, right? That the kind of the core of the story here is that protests are having big effects. They are influencing the kind of national conversation. They're influencing public opinion. And I think I make a strong case that, excuse me, they're influencing voting behavior, and that not just, kind of shifting voting behavior, but changing elections. One bit of feedback I've gotten as well, maybe we shouldn't care so much about a presidential election. In 1968, you have the lead author of the Civil Rights Act, who loses to somebody competing on Law and Order, Nixon starts the war on drugs in the early 70s. So you have kind of two competing coalitions. It's not just about a presidency, it's about two kind of philosophies of governing. And in this moment where we're thinking hard about how to reevaluate, reimagine policing, I think it's important to think about Nixon's win as the start of a durable governing coalition around much more punitive criminal justice policy. So I think it's not just about an election, and that political violence, there is a variety of evidence that shows political violence can be beneficial. It can induce concessions from elites. But when we think about the mass public in a semi-democratic society where there is, where you have to worry about, or you want to think about, what might a 90% white majority do, political violence may work against your cause. So elites may dominate political communication, but mass movements can make marginal voices heard. And so elites do not hold a monopoly on political communication. Thank you very much. So I am gonna stop sharing and happy to take any questions.
Congratulations, Omar. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
That was excellent. And Jennifer is our guest host, and she's going to, there were a million chat comments, which Justin and Christian and I were feverishly trying to get people to put in the Q&A box. And I think that what I've asked, what I prefer is the questioners be identified instead of the chat questions being curated. And I think that makes sense. Is that right, Krishna?
Sure.
Great. So Jennifer, why don't you get started, and then Krishna will call on people who've posed questions or people who want to raise their hand. Great job, Omar. I have a question, but I don't want to, I'll ask when things sag.
Yeah, I hope I've appropriately demonstrated to everybody that my sentence in my letter of recommendation is right. More ideas per minute than anybody else I know. So this is a fabulous paper. I have lots of wonky political sciencey questions, which I will spare you and everybody else. But the one question I can't resist starting with is my quote from J.P. Morgan, which is, basically, we base our quantitative analysis on Trump's victory, predicted victory, on the academic work of Omar Wasow, blah, blah, blah. So the particular question is, what's your prediction? That's maybe a totally unfair question, which you don't have to answer. The more academic-y question, or the more sort of scientific question is, what's different or what's the same now as compared to, roughly speaking, the 1960s? So there are fewer protests now. The level of violence, either state violence against protesters or protester violence or rabble-rouser violence, is lower, not non-existent, but lower. There's maybe more white support for at least the causes. Good question. We have a president who's encouraging violence, on one side anyway, unlike what I think Nixon was doing. Latinx are now a population that matter tremendously. They have a higher voting proportion than blacks do. They were not part of the story in the 1960s. So I can think of a bunch of reasons why the history that you're giving us does or does not resemble the current circumstances. Question mark.
Yeah, it's a great setup, and I would just underline a couple of the points you made. Right, I think one of the bits of feedback I've gotten a lot on this paper is that it's like I focus on Black agency and how activists are in a position to choose different kinds of tactics, but that I leave white agency out of the story, and that's that's partly a methodological choice. Right, I need to isolate one group and what they do, but it's also and a kind of an empirical reality that in the 1960s, a large part of the country is either pro-segregation or at ease with Jim Crow being the reality, and so white behavior is predictable, and there are some people who move, but there are the block of moderates or the people who are kind of maybe sympathetic to civil rights is much more contingent, and now, as you note, it's just clear that particularly among Democrats, support for racial justice concerns is much greater. We've seen in recent polling that while there's this very sharp partisan divide, approximately 1 in 5 Republicans supports kind of reforming police. but among people who support Biden, it's about 90% report supporting police. So there's just, and that averages out to be about 60% of the public is on the reform police versus engage in more punitive criminal justice policy. So that suggests one of the really big things is just this broad shift in support for kind of concerns about racial justice. I think the other really big change is the shift in media. And in the 1960s, there's a quote I use in the paper that for me is really important for understanding the dynamics. There's a protest in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and one of the lead reporters on what's then called the race beat, a guy from the New York Times, says, you know, an unprecedented picket line is a dull story. Without blood and guts, you know, blood and guts are news. And the basic issue is that in the absence of violence on the ground, it was harder to get press. Not you know, a nonviolent protest could generate headlines, but violence helped generate media. And so there was this challenge of how do you get the media to show up? How do you get them to cover it? And now in, you know, the case of the murder of George Floyd, 17-year-old teenager, Darnella Frazier, documents, you know, bears witness to his murder, and that transforms our politics. She is not herself a, you know, she's not a citizen journalist in any meaningful sense, and that, but she knows to take out her phone, document this, post it that night to Facebook, and transforms our politics. And I think one other important thing about the video, which really is an echo of Emmett Till, an echo of the beating of Rodney King, that there's work by your colleague Ryan Enos and co-authors that finds that after the 1992 uprising, where there's an enormous amount of protester-initiated violence, there seems to be a liberalizing effect on some of the voting public, particularly African Americans. And I suspect at least some of that is the combination of a video that really kind of helps put people's anger in context with the violent protests. And in these moments now, where we just have this steady drumbeat of, you know, Daniel Prude in this kind of horrific moment, or, you know, Ahmaud Arbery, and those videos both give whites, or not just whites, but non-blacks, a point of entry into this anger about police subjugation and police brutality. But also when, you know, Minneapolis goes up in flames, there's a kind of context of, well, and we see this in public opinion, I don't necessarily support those tactics is what people say, but I understand people's anger. And so I think the way in which media operate now is quite different. That said, there's contemporary polling data, not polling, survey experiments by a group out of Stanford that shows not just around civil rights, people do experiments on how do people feel about radical environmentalism, how do people feel about other kinds of groups. And the experiments show that as groups use more extreme tactics, you see potential allies disidentify with the group. And so I think that core dynamic is likely kind of human nature, that there's some capacity for sympathy and some capacity for distancing, and that's likely at play now as well. It's just, there's just, you know, a lot of other dynamics, and particularly the last one I'll touch on that you mentioned is that Trump really is much more George Wallace in this election than Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was perceived as a moderate on law and order, and George Wallace was the one who was most strongly associated with law and order. And so I think in some ways Biden, ironically, has captured more of the Nixon lane, and that has meant that Trump, with his violent rhetoric, with his crackdowns in places like Lafayette Square, has actually has undermined his own case.
Thank you. Krishna, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Bill Schwartz, would you like to pose your question? Bill?
Yep. Sorry, my picture. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Sorry. There was some, I'm not sure that the journey of the words from California to London actually was well affected, but Omar, from what I could decode, thank you very much. It was terrific. And of course, very timely. And I'm extremely interested what you say about Trump and Wallace, which, you know, we may come back to. But My question is around violence, because it seemed to me that you were using this in slightly different ways. On the one hand, you're talking about how violence was encoded, in other words, how it was represented in the media or in political life. On the other, you were talking about actual violence, as if you were having to make a decision about which protests were violent and which weren't. And I suppose my question is, when does violence become violence? And what I mean by that is, how analytically do you determine the distinction between violence and non-violence?
It's a great question. And so let me give a slightly technical answer first, and then a slightly more just sort of open answer. So I am leaning on the work of essentially 50 years of sociology, where people have developed a set of methods, and in particular, they are looking for significant levels of injury, property damage, or death, whether in newspaper records or government documents or other kinds of materials, you can attribute that to protesters. So typically, I mean, the simplest example would be, we don't see much evidence, for example, of the state engaging in arson. So the state, there might be a death where it's hard to know, was that protester initiated or state initiated, but an incident of arson is almost, I've never heard of the allegations of state initiated arson, right? So if we have a building on fire, that's significant property damage, that gets coded as a significant level of protester initiated violence. There are a couple of other criteria, at least 30 participants, and the one other subtlety, and this varies depending, I use two different data sets. In one data set, it's only events that are happening in non-institutional settings, so not on college campuses, not in a place like the Attica prison uprising. But so there's a kind of set of criteria, which are, do we see certain number of participants, significant injury, property damage, or death? If we see that, it gets coded as protester-initiated violence. There's also coding for state violence. Is tear gas used? That's a higher level of state violence than if it's not used, right? So that's the kind of technical answer. And conveniently, for my purposes, I'm not making any of those decisions, right? I am taking pre-existing work and drawing on it. So we can take issue with their methods, and these are hard questions. So I'm not trying to say they get it exactly right. But I'm not putting my thumb on the scale anywhere, right? I'm taking their data and then comparing it to some new data sets I collect, like the collection of headlines, or comparing it to public opinion data. So that's kind of a technical answer. And then I think the more kind of richer, it's not philosophical, but the sort of the hard question about defining violence is, there are lots of cases that we see on the ground now where it's like protesters are throwing water bottles at police, right? Is that violent? I mean, modestly, it's certainly different from holding a placard up. Does it graduate to significant injury, property damage, and death? No, right? So that would probably get coded as a 0. And there may be police officers who think that's bias. Conversely, I've been at events where you see the police are, amped up, and they're engaging, they're kind of provoking people, and in that kind of situation, if a protester retaliates, that would be coded as, and let's say, I mean, there incident, there's one in Albany, Georgia. A police officer is hit with a rock, tooth is chipped. Front page piece in the New York Times says 2,000 angry Negroes, engage in, I don't remember whether it says riot, but it talks about throw rocks and bottles at cops, right? And and so in that subtle shift from throwing bottles and nothing happening to an officer being hit in the tooth and there being kind of an injury, it becomes a violent event, right? And so those are pretty subtle things, but I think we do. The last thing I would say is, I think a lot of the feedback I've gotten says, well, it's meaningless to kind of have these categories. And as a social scientist, that doesn't sit well, right? I think it may be that there's a hard transition between night and day, and it's like defining when night becomes day or day becomes night is not obvious, but that doesn't mean we categorize everything as dusk. And so So I want to kind of defend some meaningful categorization. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm sorry to belabor this, is if the categories weren't telling, if they weren't used, if they were miscoded, then we wouldn't see any predictive power, right? We wouldn't see the covariance of, say, public opinion or the covariance of headlines with these different categories. And so I think even if there is noise, that tells us that even with noise, something's punching through here that's telling us something about what's meaningfully changing on the ground.
But is it not the case also that protests or demonstrations can simultaneously be violent and not violent? You must have been on a demonstration, I imagine we all have, where there's a little violent group who are intent on causing a lot of grief, and then there'll be other larger numbers often of people who are actively against that and trying to make their feelings present. That's one thing, but also in terms of time, demonstrations, protests can begin peacefully, and then something escalates, and then the people who were previously peaceful actually become very angry, and some of them will become violent. So it just seems to me that we have to hold on some way to the fluidity of these rather than depending too much on how the protests were encoded subsequently.
So they're totally fair points. And the pattern you describe, a peaceful daytime protest that escalates to violence at night, is a very common one. Sometimes that might be coded as two separate events. Sometimes it might be coded as a violent protest. Similarly, 1,000 people march and 5 people light a car on fire. That's how do we weight that? These are I agree, these are not easy things to resolve, but people developed a coding system, and I think the kind of the quantitative social scientist in me, but also I think the qualitative social scientist in me wants to say there is something meaningfully different about the 1,000 people who protest peacefully and when there's police escalation, don't respond in kind, and the one where a car is lit on fire. And if there weren't a meaningful distinction there, then much of my analysis wouldn't work. And so I think I want to hold both ideas. You're absolutely right. These are complicated events, and I think the key, though, let me kind of come back to the distinction you opened with, right, which is the actual event and the media representation of the event. In a society that has enormous biases against some outgroup, be they people who are disabled, people who have AIDS, when you have that level of antipathy to that outgroup, you should expect, and there's one other kind of media bias, which is a building on fire makes for great television. Right? I used to work in local news. Again, if it bleeds, it leads kind of thing is a bias of the media. So 5 people lighting a car on fire is almost certainly going to make the evening news because it's visually compelling. And so that's what you're up against as a protest movement. And to say, well, the whole event was 99% peaceful and only 1% violent, that's true, but that's why nonviolence is such an important kind of moral high ground to hold, because you should expect the media to key in on the most dramatic violent events. So in the back of my mind, the way if I were advising activists, I would say, you want to think like a camera, right? Like, what is going to be the image on the front page of the paper tomorrow? What is going to be the 30-second clip on the news tonight? And peaceful protests also have a challenge, which is that they're, again, they can be boring. And so you've got to think about, ACT UP would do things like, they put a condom over this very homophobic senator's home, Jesse Helms, right? It was, basically a peaceful protest, but made for dramatic TV. And those are the kinds of challenges that that groups can kind of try to think about. And of course, in the 1960s, what people did was made themselves targets of violence that appealed to the media's taste for drama and captured the moral high ground.
Thank you. Leslie, do you have a question?
I do have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks. Dr. Wasow, I'll just give you a brief synopsis of where I'm coming from. I've been living in Boston for about 40 years, but I'm a native of Washington, D.C. I was a little girl when the March on Washington occurred, and just remember the concern, an atmosphere of concern. I was about 12 when Dr. King was killed, and remember the riots, and the fact that a friend's store was burnt down. So I grew up with more of a negative reaction to rioting, but then I also grew up as a high school and college person protesting in Lafayette Square myself. I'm learning a lot more, and would love to see your recording again because I learned so much from this. The main thrust of my question at this point is the use of rioting, as I see it, the use of rioting by the occupant of the White House, and the fact that he has gone so law and order as a way of gaining popular opinion and gaining more votes for himself. And how do we deal with that? And how do we emphasize the fact that the vast majority of protests across the country at this point in time have been peaceful? And that is more of a support for Biden. So thank you for everything.
Thank you for that question. And I'm going to bring up some, this is relatively new, and so I don't have it in a slide yet. So bear with me a second. This is, so there's a survey called the American National Election Survey. And in 1968, they asked people a question that basically was, do you think the way to respond to urban unrest is more to try and solve poverty, address unemployment, get at some of the motivations for for urban unrest, or should we use the full force of the state in the context with more of a law and order approach? So here is some of that. So this is urban unrest scale, where it's a 1 to 7 scale. At one end is solve poverty, and another end is use force. And you can see for Hubert Humphrey, both African Americans and whites coded him, unsurprisingly, as sort of more liberal, although interestingly, whites had him as sort of moderate to liberal. And if we look at how Nixon was coded on this scale, he is viewed by whites as, dead center here. He is the, in between solve poverty and use force, right? And so even though Nixon is campaigning on law and order, he is perceived as kind of a moderate on this scale. The candidate who is really perceived as tough on, as the use force candidate, is segregationist George Wallace, right? And so I referenced this earlier, but just wanted to show these data, right? We see that among African Americans, overwhelmingly he's viewed as the law and the use force candidate, but also for whites, well over half view him, it's almost 70%, I think, view him as the candidate of use all available force. And I think that tells us that it's not law and order, and it's actually, you can kind of see this in the theory that I spell out, that when protesters are perceived as nonviolent and the state is engaged in brutal repression, that actually hurts the state, right? That the way I put it in the paper is that violence is a kind of double-edged sword, that it has this, if you're a protester, it has the advantage of potentially resisting white supremacy, being able to, in some cases, act in self-defense. It can also potentially draw attention to your cause. It may result in trauma, injury, and death, as we've discussed. But when there's protester-initiated violence, often the mainstream white-dominated media will focus on issues of crime. So violence has some advantages if you're the subordinate group, but it also has some disadvantages. If you're the state, we might think of, well, repression is just like you have this sort of unlimited capacity for repression, but it turns out repression on camera makes you look like a bully in a relatively democratic society. And so I think coming back to how do we make sense of Trump, and polling that suggests the public doesn't view him as, right now, Biden is viewed by 55% of the public as the candidate of safety. And I think what's really remarkable is that we've had, again, a half century of the GOP really owning the issue of law and order. And Trump is clearly competing on law and order in an echo of the 1968 campaign. And yet it's viewed by something like 40% of the public as the candidate of safety, right? So how is it Biden has captured that? And I think that polling from 1968 suggests that you can be too violent as a state actor. The vigilante violence we've seen in Kenosha, the crackdown on peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square, those sorts of events are another kind of disorder. And so people are weighing, do I care more about the protester-initiated violence, or do I care more about the threat of a kind of an authoritarian state and allied vigilantes? And I think Trump seems to be picking, not to his benefit, this kind of George Wallace lane, and that is actually working to Biden's benefit. If there are more protests that escalate to violence, this could change. People's taste for repression in some ways is conditional on how safe they feel. But so far it seems to be that Trump is not helping himself.
Thank you. Garrett, would you like to pose a question?
Hi there. Thank you so much for this. I think I had a couple questions, but one is something that Bill raised, so I just want to maybe push it a little bit further. I was wondering how, even if you reject these theories, how people who have sort of theorized violence as an insufficient way to think about the oppressed as a possibility, both in terms of expropriation and property destruction as violent, that's sort of an insufficient way to describe it, and the idea that the state is always an initiator of violence and the oppressed are always receiving violence in some sense. And that played out, so I'm in Portland, Oregon, right? And this played out in a single tweet that the mayor, Ted Wheeler, he sort of said, well, on one hand, we have police assaulting someone, but then my condo building was also, a source of violence. So this kind of parallel or conflation of property damage with state violence. And so I just wondered, even if you sort of choose one definition, to how those sort of arguments play in. And then the second question is just about the role of electoral politics in this. So how protests that are ostensibly, even if we take them very narrowly and say they're about fatal killings by police, that they're not about any particular political party, but then get sort of framed now as within the framework of electoral politics. So how do we sort of make sense of that leap?
So I'm going to break that into three questions. So the first question is, and I'm going to actually take your second one first, right? So how do we think about a kind of cycle of violence that begins with slavery and hundreds of years of state repression against African Americans, and then say, well, African Americans are engaging in violence, or protesters more generally are engaging in violence. And I think, and this is when I took Professor Gates's literature class, one of the great debates in Black culture is thinking about agency, right? And there is a model of, kind of Blacks in America, which says you are in the Richard Wright model, more of a kind of a cog in a machine, and that if you have been if you've been subject to all kinds of bigotry and repression, then that's where the story begins and ends. And then there's more of the, sorry, not Richard Wright, Richard Wright, and then there's a Ralph Ellison kind of model, which says it puts a lot more focus on the agency of the individual. And I am very firmly planting my feet on the, there are obviously, white supremacy is an enormous factor, and people are operating under incredible constraints, but they still have agency, and they can make choices, right? So John Lewis can choose to fight back or not. Children being hit with water hoses can choose to engage in violent resistance or not. Organizers can choose to organize events at 10 a.m. so that footage can get flown to New York, which they do. They pick the locations. They pick Selma and Birmingham because they know they have police chiefs who are going to escalate to violence that's going to be useful on camera. So there's all these ways in which the activists are being incredibly strategic and engaging in protests that make themselves targets of violence intentionally, and importantly, not responding with what might be a totally legitimate kind of eye for an eye model of justice. So on that question of a kind of chain of violence that begins with these acts of incredible brutality that are things like slavery and Jim Crow, I say, in some ways I'm influenced by the book Siddhartha. There's a line, I can wait, I can think, I can fast, is a line in the book, right? That like when somebody's trying to exert power over me, they cannot ultimately dominate me because I have this capacity to wait, think, and fast. And similarly, I am saying what we observe in the 1960s is African-American organizers showing enormous agency, and to put it all in the context of, no, white supremacy and the violence against African-Americans is the whole story, is to deny Black people of agency. So that's for me, like, I can't concede that that last line of, are activists able to make choices about whether to escalate, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is around property damage. And we can think about this in a couple of different ways. One is, and again, I think this is related in some ways to the agency thing. We might say violence is legitimate, right? That like Nelson Mandela is engaged in violent resistance against apartheid. There is Jewish resistance, violent resistance to the Holocaust, right? We might say violence is a legitimate tactic, but it still might not be strategic, right? And so in some ways, I'm not even particularly concerned about whether arson is legitimate or property damage is legitimate. In the context of a society where you are 10% of the population, it may be legitimate to engage in arson. We see evidence, under slavery of people using arson as a tactic of resistance. So we might say arson is legitimate, but does it advance your cause? And if our test, to take a kind of militant logic by any means necessary, that also suggests that we care less about the means and more about the outcome. And if the outcome is an increase in taste for punitive policies, then that would suggest that this is an ineffective policy, an ineffective tactic, potentially a counterproductive tactic. But I also think that kind of logic has I think it's a very appealing logic for people trying to defend protester-initiated violence, but it ignores the enormous costs that Black communities have borne by these tactics. So I mentioned two economists, Margo and Collins. They looked at job markets 20 years later in cities that had violent protests, and labor markets were significantly depressed in the Black communities that had significant protester-initiated violence as compared to the ones that didn't. Housing markets are significantly depressed in the cities that have more protester-initiated violence, and the cost of that is borne primarily by African Americans. And so I think there's a kind of, for me, too simple logic that says, well, there's theft that happens in corporate America or the state, therefore that justifies this other kind of counter violence. And I'm not saying that's wrong. It's just I think there's a lot more to the story, and part of that story is the cost borne by African Americans, which is again non-trivial, and it speaks to the kinds of ways in which the larger debate it shifts the conversation away from a focus on rights and to a conversation on order. And so I think that's very counterproductive for groups. And then subtly, there's a great book, Black Against Empire, that talks about the Black Panthers And among the things that come through is that, but you can also look at cross-national work, that basically when a subordinate group engages in violent resistance, even if we think it's legitimate, that becomes a pretext for the state to engage in much more aggressive repression. And so if you are outnumbered and outgunned, you are 10% of the population up against a state that will use extra legal violence, will kill, oh my God, I'm blanking, Chicago, Hampton.
Fred Hampton.
Yeah, Fred Hampton, thank you. You shoot Fred Hampton in his sleep, right? That will engage in all kinds of, again, COINTELPRO kinds of activities to crush a movement. There's a certain kind of hubris that says you're going to take on the most powerful military in the world as a small statistical minority. And that's
Omar,
different from saying, yeah.
Can you give us 10 more minutes, because Jennifer, and I hope you can hang in here. We started a little bit late, setting up technically, and you still have a bunch of questions. So Jennifer, can you hang on for 10 more minutes?
Just about. And then I've got another meeting, but I can.
Okay, hard out in 10 minutes. Kristen, take it away. Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Omar.
Okay, Martha, do you have a question you can present?
Yes. So thank you so much, Omar, for that. That talk was really interesting. My question is one of, if you zoom in, and I don't know how much this you do, but have you kind of looked at, for example, the kinds of whites you're likely to lose from a Democratic coalition once you see an escalation in violence based on gender, religion, age, things like that. And then I'm also interested, if you kind of zoom in on the violence, does the type of violence make a difference in terms of how the headlines are constructed, and how the perception that people have of that violence, of whites have of that violence? So for example, if it's seen to be, if an officer, for example, if police are injured in that violence, if that becomes, or if the extent, the number of blocks that are damaged, that kind of thing. So I'm just kind of curious about how much you want to zoom in on these questions to see kind of where you get more kind of precise analytics coming out of this really interesting research.
Thank you. Yeah, so in some of the earlier models of this, there was a kind of more of a dose response coding of protest activity. So more protesters would have a bigger dose, more arrests might have a bigger dose. And the model was just complicated enough that people were like, simplify, because there are too many moving parts that I don't trust that it's all, it was just harder for people to understand. But I do find in some of the kind of follow-up tests I do that an event that's closer to an election has more oomph than one that's further away from the election, right? So we should expect, so I find effects up to 2 years, but you can actually get effects up to 4 years. They're just much weaker. And certainly events that are now 2 months out should still be fresh on people's minds. I find bigger events have more of an effect. So, more participants, more arrests are going to help move opinion. So broadly, our intuition there seems to hold up. But again, 2020 is different from 1968. And so there's some things where I pay a lot of attention to like the localness of this. And I think in an era where politics is increasingly nationalized, people are getting, there was a segregated media before. And so I think it's important to note that we've had media bubbles before. And part of what the protesters were doing in the 1960s was trying to punch through those media bubbles of a segregated pro-Jim Crow press or an indifferent, national press. But now it's really sorted in partisan ways that may mean that, the kind of loop. There was a period where Fox was showing coverage of violence in Minneapolis 2 weeks after the fact. And so there's a kind of, it doesn't matter necessarily what's happening on the ground yesterday if I can use footage that's 2 weeks old. And then to your point, I think this is a really important question on who is it who's moving. And there's nice work by two political scientists, Mark Hetherington, I'm forgetting the other person's first name, but Weiler, Hetherington and Weiler, looking at a kind of broad shift around what they call authoritarianism, or in their latest book, Prius or Pickup, they used a different framework. But it's basically that there are people who have a high taste for order. And the people who have a high taste for order may not be opposed to civil rights, but there's a they're kind of weighing these two things. So I mean, just to make it personal, I got an email when in the immediate wake of Minneapolis from a young man who said, I'm sympathetic to concerns as a white person. I'm very sympathetic to concerns about police violence, but my wife works in a supermarket and my dad works in a Walmart, and I worry, what if one of those buildings went up in flames? And in that, and you can see, so there's somebody who's cross-pressured, and that's a very kind of we can kind of understand his concern, but more generally, there just seems to be a personality disposition that's more order, that has a greater concern about society being orderly and the kind of tradition being followed, and that in the pre-1968 period, there are a lot of essentially order-minded Democrats, and when they become, and then as order comes to the fore of their consciousness, they sort into the Republican Party. And that what Hetherington and Weiler argue is that over the last 50 years, our party has been sorting into the people who are more order-minded and the people who are kind of more open to change. And I think that helps explain, and if you read the book that came before Prius or Pickup, I'm forgetting its title, they tell a story that essentially is a roadmap for Donald Trump's ascendance, which is that there's going to be a candidate who has, who appeals to this kind of increasingly authoritarian tendency in the Republican Party. And so part of the story I'm telling, which again comes back, which I didn't answer in the last question, why do we care about electoral politics? Well, part of what's going on is you're structuring the polity in a way that says, oh, now we're going to kind of split into this more order-minded, law and order focused coalition, and that durable coalition is really a significant part of why we have the more punitive criminal justice policy we have now. So I think it's easy to, I think, look at one moment and say, well, burning the Minneapolis police station was justified given the violence that Officer Chauvin used against George Floyd. But if the echoes of that are more punitive criminal justice policy, or a governing coalition across the United States that's able to kind of really ratchet up 3 strikes you're outlaw, tough on crime kind of policy, then that might cause one to kind of think more deeply about, well, does the short run pay off? Do we worry about what happens 2 or 3 steps out in the game?
Thank you.
Thank you. Eve, will you ask a question as the final one of the session?
Eve, you are muted.
Yeah, thank you for an amazing talk, and the Q&A has been great. So I really am gonna add a couple questions, but I'm gonna focus on the second question that I had, which is around COVID. I was really interested in the thread of your argument that dealt with the environmental circumstances, climate circumstances on kind of squashing or shifting protests. And I was really interested in this, maybe outside of the frame of your project, so maybe you might speculate on how the COVID crisis or the COVID reality has either what kind of data you're already seeing about protests, right? We can look on TV and see that it hasn't squashed it at all, but I'm really interested in if there's any sort of preliminary data coming out about COVID and protests, and if this particular moment is shifting the way that you're thinking about that earlier the 60s moment and that threat of environment or climate.
Great questions, both. I mean, let me. I think one useful invitation in your last question is sort of what have I learned in the last 6 months? How am I thinking about politics changed. And I think I've gotten actually a newfound appreciation for the value of violence. I try very carefully in the paper to say violence, might be legitimate, but may not be strategic. But I think there may be a kind of small amount of violence that, in the work of scholar Dan Gillian, he sort of emphasizes that how violence creates a sense of urgency. And I think there was a way in which the violence in Minneapolis may have been large enough to get everybody's attention and small enough to not necessarily lead to a kind of taste for repression and backlash. And so that's kind of a nonlinear kind of relationship that's hard for me to kind of model. But I think small amounts of protester-initiated violence may actually be beneficial. But you light one building on fire, you might light a whole block on fire, and that's the kind of thing we've seen. And so that's a very, it's hard to say what that right amount is. And again, there are events like Los Angeles where we see some evidence of a liberalizing effect in LA, but also the first Republican mayor in 36 years gets elected following the LA uprising. So that's one thing I've learned, though, is I think just, it's not inconsistent with my results, but it's just sort of something I've been thinking about. And then more narrowly on this question of COVID, one of the great problems for any protest movement is getting a bunch of people to show up at one place. There's a kind of what social scientists will often call a collective action problem, right? It's like, I want you to go do the work of the protest. I'm going to sit at home and watch TV. And so how do you coordinate people? Well, one weird thing I think COVID has done is there are a lot more people who aren't juggling all of their normal routines, picking up kids from school or needing to be at work at 9 a.m. And so you've got a lot of people who are kind of in a capacity to mobilize. And so certainly the injustice of George Floyd's murder is the spark of this unprecedented wave of protests. But I think COVID has played a role in allowing people to coordinate more easily, in part because there's just less else going on in society to kind of pull people in other directions. And that's not to take anything away from the moral power of those movements, but I think we've never seen something quite this big, and I think that's partly a function of we've also not had so many people kind of in the same state of consuming media at home and wanting some way to express their anger. And then at the maybe the most kind of core level of life and death, there's been a bunch of interesting studies using things like cell phone data to map protest activity, which is quite new. There have been, this is not protest related, but there's a recent study that's been getting a lot of press in the last 48 hours where cell phone data on the Sturgis motorcycle rally is associated with about 250,000 new cases of COVID. We haven't seen similar results from the Black Lives Matter protests. That doesn't mean that there wasn't spreading, but it seems like outdoor events plus masks may be a very good protection. And so thankfully, there doesn't seem to have been a kind of super spreader effect of the protests on COVID. And then maybe one last thing, just I was listening to a podcast of a colleague at Harvard, Leah Wright-Rigueur. I'm not sure I'm getting her name right. She has a book on the loneliness of the Black Republican, and was interviewed on Ezra Klein's podcast. And she noted something which for me is just very powerful. And so I'm quoting her really, which is that apparently George Floyd was diagnosed of having COVID in his lungs after his death. And so there's a way in which the kind of spark of this, he is not just a victim of police violence, of state violence, of the inequality in how Black people are policed in America. He is also a victim of a kind of medical injustice that is the state that we have a government that has profoundly failed to protect our most vulnerable citizens from COVID, particularly African Americans. And so he's sitting at the intersection of those two injustices. And Professor Rigueur also notes he's in Minneapolis looking for work, right? So there's a kind of an income inequality story that's at the heart of this too. And so I think there's a way in which we can look at the story of George Floyd first and foremost as a story about a movement to say we need to rethink policing in America, but it's also a story that kind of, as happens again and again, braids together multiple injustices in the body of one person, and should encourage us to think not just about policing, but about the ways systemic racism operates on many levels.
Superb, excellent, Omar. It was fabulous.
Thank
Jennifer,
you.
thank you for the marvelous introduction. Omar, thank you for getting the year off so brilliantly. Krishna, thank you for being such a gracious and generous host. Thanks to Justin for handling all the tech questions. I think we got it down now. Omar, give Jen my love.
Will do. And again, Professor Hochschild, Professor Gates, I wouldn't be here without you. So I'm so grateful for all of your support over the years.
Good, 10% of your income for the rest of your life then.
That's the deal.
I'll settle for a conversation soon.
We love you, Omar.
Thank you.
See you guys next week, everyone. Thanks again, Jennifer. Besitos.
Thank you.
Bye.